Welcome back to the show. I've been sitting here with Mr. Glenn Fubler, and he was just sharing some information with me about a funny story about the couch. What would you like to share with all of us about that?
Well, Yvonne, when you said couch and your show's name, On the Couch,
yes,
I grew up in North Village, a small house in North Village, where I slept on the couch up to the age of 14 before we moved out of North Village.
But what do you mean by North Village? I only know North Village, the club,
well,
the football club.
I mean the community North Village. I mean a wonderful community that bonded by the government house on the one hand, down to Dock Hill on the other. That whole area is known as North Village.
Okay,
and
I didn't know that.
It's one of the most important, I think, communities in the island. And there are numerous stories. You talk about stories, but there are lots of stories that make up what we are called Bermuda. And so you know, when we talk about a couch, it says a lot about my background.
Okay.
And that, in fact, when I look at it, looking back, I can see Bermuda changing over many years.
Yes.
As you know, I taught for some 20 years. But for the last 15, I've been working at the Labor and Training Department as a senior labor relations officer.
Yes, okay.
But in between and even before that, I was very involved in the community.
Yes.
You talked about being a community activist. But to me, each of us has to be an activist in our own society. Going back to stories that, in fact, we are asked to actually be the authors of our own stories.
That's right.
And Bermuda has some wonderful stories.
So tell me, do you feel as if you left education and moved into you know, your role as a community activist, or do you feel that you're still an educator? Well,
education, you know, the root of that word is from a Latin term, means to unfold, to develop, to grow.
Yes.
And so education is something that happens all the time. Now, for instance, schooling is only one part of education,
I believe
but it's a lifelong process. So everywhere we are, the talents and the skills, etc., that I drew from education are something that I use every day. But we are all educators.
Yes.
Each one of us are educators.
And you mentioned, of course, the fact that you know, we all tell a story. Do you consider yourself a historian?
Well, no. In fact, when I was in school, I went to Berkeley, and I did 8 subjects, GCE, and the only course I failed was history.
Really?
Why? Because, in fact, what I found, I was alienated from the history I saw in the books. But later on, that I got into my story, our story, and of course, that's a big part of what I do and what I am,
Absolutely.
is to trace and uncover the stories that we are. You may be aware that I was involved with the getting the people who organized the theater boycott back in '59 to come out publicly. You might have known that, in fact, those in the progressive group that organized this were secret. It was a secret group, and they maintained that secrecy for several decades. In 1999, when I found out about some of the people who were involved, I went around and found that about 4 or 5 of them were my former teachers.
Really?
And people were surprised that the people who had been involved in this.
Yes.
So getting involved in that. And you know, the only reason they came public, and they would only come public if everybody agreed. So it was a pact. They had signed a pact.
Yes.
And
like a class action.
Yeah, and together. They said, look, we either go together or we stay together.
Yes.
So there was one last guy, and you would know him as Dr. Clifford Maxwell, he was my former boss at Berkeley. He was the person holding out. But when I convinced him that, look, our young people need to know these stories, that's when he decided to come forward and publicize the fact that they were the ones that organized this the most significant change in Bermuda's history in the last couple of centuries was the theater boycott, because what it did was take down the barriers of race that had been involved. You know, in fact, we're here at the lovely Elba Beach. Before 1959, people of color couldn't come to the front entrance of Elba Beach.
And now here we are filming
the show. Filming the show. So it shows you how things have changed.
That has happened, yes. And you know, you also mentioned the community. What types of changes have you seen? And if you can just take us also into Imagine Bermuda. Right.
Well, you know, and going back to my old neighborhood, in fact, we lived as a neighborhood. But I think what's happened nowadays, if we look at it sort of longitudinally, a lot of us don't even know our neighbors.
It's true.
You know, I mean, actually today, We have a neighbor, one of our closest neighbors. I don't even know how she looks because she wears a helmet. She's been living there for about 2 or 3 years. She's one of those helmets that you just see the eyes.
Oh, okay.
I don't even know how.
And she wears
looks.
that helmet when she walks into the door.
Right. You know, so that gives you an idea. Many of us don't know our neighbors, but at the same time, though, I live in Smiths Parish now, and we have worked over the last, say, about 5 years. Every Christmas time, we get together. Not all of us.
The neighborhood.
But the neighborhood. Like just this past Boxing Day was at my house. So we go from house to house, and we, everybody brings a dish, etc. And we learn about each other. We have a diverse neighborhood.
Now, when I was younger, I remember the Frizzell's Hill block parties, and I know that last year they attempted to do the same thing in December.
Right.
So I think some neighborhoods are trying to bring back that, community relationship building and things of that sort. Talk to me about Imagine Bermuda.
Well, Imagine Bermuda is an organization that I started about 3 years ago, just before the year before 400th anniversary, which was 2009.
Yes.
Recognizing that this was a significant anniversary of the island, we got together a variety of people who are involved in other organizations.
Yes.
People like Margaret Hallett, who's a former principal from Summersfield Academy, Janet Ferguson. A lot of people came together and we said, we need to, one, help our community to understand its story.
That's right.
And so we got involved with that. As you remember, the 400th anniversary was a time when people were telling stories. We worked with the Corporation of Hamilton to put a monument to the theater boycott, because not only was it the 400th anniversary of the Sea Venture, but it was also the 50th anniversary of the success of the theater boycott.
Yes.
So that's a part of what we do. We look at Imagine Bermuda as an organization that's looking at aspects of our history, our assets, and then moving with the community to try to enhance and develop collaborations so that we can tell the story to the current generation and also to strengthen what we are as a community. Now, in that period of time is when we saw this evolution of gun violence that we see today. I mean, when I look back to my days in growing up in the North Village, I would have never expected something like this to happen.
It's true.
But that's not to say that we didn't have times when, people did, were involved in what we call criminal activity. And we had our issues with police. In fact, when I was university age, I was involved in an organization called the Black Beret Cadre, which was a bit like you heard about the Black Panthers in the States. It was a small organization that challenged the status quo of the day. And then sometimes we got off track and got in trouble with the police, etc. And maybe some people might describe us as a gang, in the context.
Okay, yes.
But there's one other piece there, though, is that, and this is something through Imagine Bermuda we like to share with our young people, because we're doing a lot of networking and trying to, meet various organizations. In fact, this past Friday, we had an event at a lunchtime event at the Hamilton Seventh-day Adventist, in which about 80 people came together after invitations, and of that 80 people, 40 were young people from the various schools. 5 schools were involved.
And you're speaking of middle and high school?
No, just high school.
High school.
The senior ones.
So private and
private
public.
and public. So it was Warwick Academy, DHS, BI, Cedar Bridge. The only public high school was Cedar Bridge.
Oh, Cedar Bridge, yes.
What happened? Berkeley had something else planned, so it clashed with what they were doing. But in fact, we spent that 3 hours. We had there 4 members of the progressive group, because that week was the anniversary of the first meeting of the progressive group. So we had Clifford and Florence Maxwell.
Yes.
They, and also a couple named Harvey, Gerald and Isola Harvey. You might know their daughters, Donna Harvey Mabry and Lisa Harvey.
Yes, the name sounds
and interesting enough, now at the event, they talked to the young people. The young people asked them, well, what got you into coming together in this secret group? Now remember, if you could put yourself in context, imagine what was happening at the time. They were relatively young at the time. They were in their 20s, much like the young people that you have here today. And what they recognized was that the challenges of the time, somebody had to do something about it. But you can sit around and talk about it, but then you got to come to a point when you start doing. And that's where those narratives have to turn into action.
Exactly.
And
and I think a lot of people get stuck just talking about the issues.
Yes,
you know, you don't see many people getting up and making change.
Well, on that point, though, I would say a lot of people are involved, but from the Imagine Bermuda perspective is that if we can collaborate in the activities that we do. For
instead
instance,
of silos.
Instead of silos. Like, look at throughout the island the number of clubs, sports clubs, and et cetera that we have. I mean, they're doing a wonderful job, but it's a question of networking those, you know, good things in the context of really strengthening our community.
Absolutely.
So I would say that there are a lot of people out there doing more can do, and we're in that invitational mode.
And that's what I was just going to ask you. How can people be more involved with Imagine Bermuda?
Well, one way is that they can email me at Fubler at North Rock. Is an easy email address.
Fubler at North Rock.
And you can find out about our meetings. We meet on a regular basis, and we have these various you know, projects and campaigns. Now, out of that networking session this past Friday, of those groups of young people, and interesting enough, the Work Academy students came up with a proposal that they put on the table and looked interesting. So the other schools have committed to actually, in going forward, is to sit down with the Work Academy students to come up with a collaborative piece that, for instance, you take an idea sometimes. Sometimes people think, well, I've got this idea, I'm going with it. But if you could take it and work it, you know, and that's what collaboration is all about.
And I love the fact that, of course, you guys, you know, went directly to the high schools. My alma mater actually is Bermuda Institute. I also taught at Berkeley, so hopefully they can get on board at some point as well. Hopefully the invitation is still open to them.
Right, no, well, Berkeley and the Bermuda College are on board. The Bermuda College is working with us too, and so the other one would be Munson Agnes. We'll be reaching out to Munson. They were interested, but so we're looking to get all of those various stakeholders together to really, because we're a small community, and to get away from the silos that we talked about before. I found, and that's in all my involvement in the 40 years that I've been involved in the community, the potential that we have as an island is fantastic. You know, I mean, and that was how we opened the session on Fridays. We asked the question, how do you feel blessed personally? And actually a Cedar Bridge boy came up to me, and he was struggling a bit because he has to be on crutches, right? And what he told me, he said, look, I'm just glad to be born in a place like Bermuda.
That's awesome.
You know, and when we think about it, and somebody else said it, I heard say it, is that every time they land back in Bermuda, you know, it just hits them that, hey, I'm glad I can call this home.
Exactly. For me personally, when the plane flies over the island and you start seeing the water change from the dark blue to the light blue, I get excited. That's me personally. Wonderful. Well, we've run out of time, sir. And that's a shame because I've enjoyed our conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming by. And remember that you always have a place on the couch with us. Thank you very much. In just a few minutes, we'll be back with the show.
I'm a protagonist for change.
Yes.
Like all the violence that we live in, you know, social unrest, whatever you want to call it, is something that can change as long as the people are progressive and galvanized and unified for change, meaningful change.